Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into stories that the world has not been able to forget. Tonight, we are traveling back to the early 1990s, to a city often described as one of America's most vibrant and creative, Austin, Texas. But behind the music, the culture, and the growing reputation of the city, a night of unimaginable tragedy would leave scars that are still felt more than 3 decades later. This is the story of what has come to be known as the Yogurt Shop Murders. On the evening of December 6, 1991, Austin was winding down from an ordinary Friday. Families were heading home, teenagers were out with friends, and holiday decorations were beginning to glow across the city. In a small frozen yogurt shop, 4 young girls were spending their night, some working part-time, others simply enjoying their youth. No one could have imagined that within hours, this cheerful little store would be transformed into the site of one of the most shocking crimes in Texas history. When the fire department responded to flames erupting from the yogurt shop, they expected to find just another late-night accident. But as the smoke cleared, firefighters made a chilling discovery. Inside the shop, the bodies of 4 teenage girls were found. Their lives had been brutally cut short, and the fire had been set deliberately, in what investigators believed was an attempt to erase every trace of the crime. Austin, a community known for its warmth and openness, suddenly became gripped by fear and heartbreak. The victims were quickly identified: Jennifer Harbison, just 17 years old, her younger sister Sarah, 15, their close friend Eliza Thomas, also 17, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. These were girls with dreams, families, and futures ahead of them, dreams that were stolen in an act of violence that seemed almost unthinkable. Parents across the city clutched their children closer that week, while neighbors whispered about the kind of cruelty it would take to harm 4 innocent lives in such a way. News of the murders spread rapidly. Local and national media descended on Austin. And suddenly this once quiet shop became the center of an investigation that would stretch across decades. Police scrambled to gather evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following leads, but what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Was it planned, or was it random? Who could be capable of such brutality, and why? From that night forward, the Yogurt Shop Murders would haunt Austin. They would shape the way the city viewed safety, trust, and justice. And for the families of the victims, the tragedy was not just a headline, it was a lifetime of grief, questions, and the desperate hope that one day, answers would come. As we open this case together, we are not just revisiting a crime scene from 1991. We are stepping into a story of pain, resilience, controversy, and unanswered questions that continues to this very day. As the investigation unfolded, the most heartbreaking part of this tragedy came into focus: the lives of the 4 young victims. They were not just names in a case file. They were daughters, sisters, and friends whose stories ended far too soon. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison was described as responsible and kind, someone who balanced school, work, and family life with determination. That night, she was working at the yogurt shop with her close friend Eliza Thomas, also 17. Eliza was known for her warmth and her bright personality, a young woman who was already thinking about her future and the possibilities that awaited her after high school. Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Harbison, was just 15. She had stopped by the shop to spend time with her sister before heading home. Sarah was full of energy, with a sense of humor that friends remembered long after. She looked up to her older sister. And being with Jennifer that evening was meant to be just another moment of ordinary teenage closeness. The youngest of the group was Amy Ayers, only 13 years old. Amy had plans of her own, filled with the excitement and curiosity of someone just beginning her teenage years. She had joined her friends at the shop that evening, probably never imagining that this ordinary night would take such a horrific turn. Together, the 4 girls represented a snapshot of youth in Austin at the time: ambitious, joyful, and hopeful for what the future might bring. But their dreams, their laughter, and their futures were stolen in one single night of violence. For the families, the discovery was beyond devastating. Parents and relatives rushed to the scene, only to be met with the shocking reality that their daughters would never return home. For neighbors and classmates, the grief was overwhelming. Schools held vigils, churches gathered in prayer, and the entire city seemed united in mourning. But grief quickly turned to fear. If something like this could happen in a small yogurt shop in a safe part of town, then nowhere felt safe anymore. People began locking their doors earlier, keeping closer watch over their children, and questioning how a community so full of life could suddenly feel so vulnerable. As investigators pieced together what had happened, one detail became clear: this was not an accident. The fire had been deliberately set, and the brutality of the murder suggested a level of planning and cruelty that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The central question became unavoidable: who could do this, and why? The murders of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy were not just crimes against 4 young girls, they were crimes against an entire community. The sense of innocence in Austin was shattered, replaced by uncertainty and unease. From this moment forward, the yogurt shop murders were no longer just a tragic event. They became a puzzle, one that investigators, journalists, and ordinary citizens would spend decades trying to solve. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, the search for answers would take many unexpected and controversial turns. When the flames were first reported at the yogurt shop on the night of December 6, 1991, many assumed it was simply a tragic accident. Electrical malfunctions, kitchen mishaps, or even a careless mistake could easily ignite a fire in a small store. But as investigators stepped inside the charred remains, it became clear that this was no ordinary blaze. The fire had not started naturally, it had been set on purpose. Forensic experts at the time determined that the fire was an intentional act, meant to consume the building and everything inside. The intensity of the flames was suspicious, and evidence of accelerant suggested that someone had poured fuel or another substance to spread the fire quickly. In other words, whoever committed the murders had deliberately tried to erase their tracks by reducing the scene to ashes. This discovery added another layer of horror to an already devastating case. Not only had the lives of 4 young girls been taken, but the killers had also gone to chilling lengths to cover their crimes. Investigators immediately understood the implication: the arson was not random, but calculated. The perpetrators had the presence of mind to attempt a cleanup, suggesting they were determined to walk away without leaving behind clues. Unfortunately, the flames succeeded in destroying much of the potential evidence. Fingerprints were burned away, objects were melted, and the crime scene was contaminated by smoke and water from firefighters' hoses. Detectives faced the daunting task of reconstructing events from fragments of what remained. Every small piece of evidence had to be treated like gold, because so much had already been lost to the fire. Still, some critical findings emerged. The positioning of the bodies and the condition of the store told investigators that the victims had been killed before the fire was set. This was not a tragic accident turned deadly. It was a deliberate act of murder followed by an attempt to conceal it. The fact that 4 victims were targeted suggested either multiple attackers or at least one person with a terrifying level of control. The use of fire to destroy evidence also spoke volumes about the mindset of the killers. It suggested knowledge, perhaps even experience with criminal behavior. Ordinary people rarely think to use arson as a cover-up, but in this case, the fire was central to the killer's plan. It was not only an attempt to hide physical evidence but also a way to send a message: they wanted the world to see nothing but devastation. For Austin investigators, this created a haunting problem. The very thing they needed most, uncontaminated evidence, was exactly what the fire had destroyed. Each new theory, each new lead, would have to contend with the fact that the crime scene itself had been carefully sabotaged. As news of the deliberate fire spread, fear in the community deepened. People no longer believed this was a random tragedy. Instead, they were forced to face the chilling reality: someone had intentionally slaughtered 4 girls and then coldly attempted to erase the truth. This was not just violence. It was violence carried out with calculation, planning, and terrifying precision. The stage was now set for a complex and frustrating investigation. The question remained: would the killers' attempt to destroy the evidence succeed in hiding their identities forever, or could investigators find a way to uncover the truth hidden in the ashes? In the immediate aftermath of the yogurt shop murders, detectives were desperate for answers. With the crime scene heavily damaged by fire, they had to start with the most basic questions: why had this happened? What was the motive? The first and most straightforward theory was that the murders were the result of a robbery gone wrong. At the scene, investigators noted that money appeared to be missing from the cash register. In a city where burglaries and small robberies were not uncommon, it was not a far stretch to imagine that someone had entered the shop intending to steal cash, and, for reasons unknown, escalated into violence. This theory seemed to make sense at first. A small yogurt shop at night, staffed by young workers, could easily have been seen as a soft target. Perhaps the perpetrators expected a quick and simple theft, only to find themselves trapped in a situation that spiraled out of control. The fire could then be explained as a desperate attempt to cover up the robbery-turned-homicide. But as investigators looked closer, inconsistencies began to emerge. For one, while some money was missing, the amount stolen did not align with the scale of the crime. The level of violence used against the girls was far beyond what would normally occur in a robbery. Typically, in robberies, perpetrators seek to grab cash and leave quickly. Here, however, the attackers had stayed long enough to restrain, kill, and then stage an arson. That was not the behavior of simple thieves, it was the behavior of someone with darker intentions. Additionally, detectives found it puzzling that the shop's receipts and other valuables had not been completely cleared out. If financial gain were the sole motive, why leave behind evidence of transactions or partial money? The sloppiness of the theft did not match the calculated act of setting a fire to erase clues. It raised an unsettling possibility: was robbery just a convenient cover story, while the real motive was something far more disturbing? For the families of the victims, the robbery theory was especially painful. The idea that their daughters' lives could have been cut short over a handful of stolen bills was almost unbearable. Yet many parents also doubted the explanation, believing that whoever had committed such a horrific act must have had deeper, more sinister reasons. The robbery hypothesis, however, was not entirely abandoned. In the early days of the investigation, police scoured the area for known petty criminals, interviewed individuals with histories of burglary, and questioned anyone rumored to have targeted small shops. But each lead seemed to collapse under scrutiny. No suspect perfectly matched the evidence, and the missing cash alone was not enough to sustain the theory. Still, the idea of a robbery gone wrong lingered, if only because detectives had so little else to work with. With the fire having destroyed much of the forensic evidence, motives could only be pieced together from fragments. For the community, this theory provided a grim but somewhat comprehensible narrative, a theft that spiraled into chaos. But deep down, many suspected there had to be more to the story. And indeed, as weeks turned into months, the case grew stranger. Witness accounts, inconsistent evidence, and the lack of solid suspects pushed investigators to explore new directions. The robbery explanation would soon give way to more complex and controversial theories, ones that would draw the case out for decades. As the weeks passed and the shock of the yogurt shop murder settled into grief, investigators faced mounting pressure to deliver answers. The city of Austin wanted justice. The families of the victims demanded closure. And the national media, captivated by the sheer brutality of the case, kept the spotlight burning. But despite the intensity of the investigation, the road ahead was anything but straightforward. In the early 1990s, detectives chased down every lead they could find. Rumors swirled about suspicious figures seen near the yogurt shop that night. Some witnesses recalled men loitering in the area, others claimed to have spotted unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby. Yet, when police followed up, these tips often led to dead ends. Without clear forensic evidence, so much of it destroyed by the fire, investigators were left relying heavily on testimony, hunches, and circumstantial details. Several individuals became persons of interest, at least temporarily. Some had minor criminal records, others fit the vague descriptions given by frightened witnesses. Detectives brought them in for questioning, hoping for a breakthrough. But time and again, the results were the same: inconsistencies, weak connections, and nothing solid enough to move forward. In some cases, investigators even pursued suspects who seemed promising at first, only to later admit the evidence did not hold up. One man was questioned extensively because he had been seen near the shop on the night of the murders. Another was flagged because he had a history of arson and burglary. But without DNA matches, physical evidence, or reliable eyewitness identification, suspicions could not turn into convictions. The longer the case dragged on, the more complicated it became. Some in the community began to worry that police were chasing the wrong people. Others feared that the true killers might never be caught at all. Rumors spread like wildfire, each new name whispered in Austin neighborhoods, adding to the cloud of suspicion. The investigation seemed to widen rather than narrow, casting doubt over dozens of potential suspects but never zeroing in on one definitive perpetrator. For the families, this was unbearable. Each time a suspect was brought in, there was a flicker of hope that maybe, finally, justice would come. And each time that hope was dashed, the sense of frustration deepened. They had to endure not just the loss of their daughters, but the endless cycle of promises, false leads, and disappointments. Meanwhile, detectives themselves felt the strain. The case was as complex as it was tragic. Without clear evidence, every suspect seemed both possible and impossible at the same time. The weight of community expectation only added to the pressure. The desire to solve the crime was strong, but the foundation of the case remained fragile. By the mid-1990s, the yogurt shop murders had already begun to take on the characteristics of a cold case, unsolved, haunting, and painfully elusive. Yet the investigation did not stop. Authorities believed that with persistence, someone would eventually crack. Or some piece of evidence would surface. And indeed, by the end of the decade, new suspects would emerge, men whose names would become permanently tied to the case. But as the world would later learn, even those high-profile arrests would only add more controversy and more unanswered questions to an already tangled mystery. By the late 1990s, the yogurt shop murders had haunted Austin for nearly a decade. With public pressure mounting and the families of the victims demanding progress, investigators pushed harder than ever to find suspects. Then, in 1999, a dramatic announcement shook the city. 4 men were indicted for the murders: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The 4 men had been teenagers at the time of the crime, not much older than the victims themselves. Their names had surfaced in connection with the case years earlier, but without solid evidence, they had not been charged. Now, investigators claimed that new developments tied them directly to the crime. For many, this seemed like the long-awaited breakthrough. The theory put forward by prosecutors was grim. They argued that the 4 had entered the yogurt shop on that December night, planning either a robbery or some act of mischief that spiraled out of control. The result, they claimed, was the horrific murder of 4 young girls, followed by the arson meant to destroy the evidence. Central to the case were the confessions obtained from Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. Under interrogation, both men described in detail what supposedly happened that night. Their statements seemed to align with certain aspects of the crime scene, and prosecutors used this as their strongest evidence. The community, desperate for justice, saw hope in these admissions. But from the beginning, there were doubts. Critics pointed out that the confessions had been obtained after hours of intense questioning, raising concerns about coercion. The details in their statements often shifted, and in some instances, they appeared to echo information that police themselves had already suggested. Defense attorneys argued that the men had been pressured into saying what investigators wanted to hear. Maurice Pierce, often described as the alleged ringleader, denied involvement and maintained his innocence throughout. Forrest Wellborn, meanwhile, faced weaker evidence and was eventually released when a grand jury declined to indict him further. That left Springsteen and Scott as the primary defendants. Despite the controversies, prosecutors pressed forward. For the families of the victims, the indictments brought a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, there was relief at last, someone was being held accountable. On the other, there were lingering questions about whether the real killers had truly been caught. The trials of Springsteen and Scott would soon follow, turning the yogurt shop murders into not only a criminal case but also a courtroom drama watched across the country. It seemed that justice might finally be within reach. Yet beneath the surface, cracks in the case were already beginning to show. The very evidence used to charge the men would later become the center of one of the most controversial reversals in Texas legal history. The indictments in 1999 marked a turning point in the story. For the first time, the investigation seemed to have clear suspects, confessions, and a path toward closure. But as the next decade unfolded, it would become painfully clear that this was not the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning of a new chapter filled with doubt, appeals, and heartbreaking setbacks. The trials of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott became the centerpiece of the yogurt shop murders case. For many in Austin, this was the moment they had waited nearly a decade for, the chance to see justice delivered for the 4 young girls whose lives had been stolen in 1991. But almost from the beginning, the proceedings revealed just how fragile the foundation of the case truly was. The state's case rested primarily on the confessions of both men. Robert Springsteen was the first to be tried, and prosecutors pointed to his detailed statements as proof of guilt. In his account, he admitted to being inside the yogurt shop during the murders, describing the events in a way that, according to prosecutors, matched aspects of the crime scene. Jurors, presented with his words and the horrific nature of the crime, ultimately convicted him in 2001. He was sentenced to death. Michael Scott's trial followed in 2002. Like Springsteen, his conviction was also based largely on what he had said during interrogation. Under questioning, Scott gave an account of being part of the group that carried out the killings, though his details often shifted from one version to another. Despite these inconsistencies, his statements were enough for the jury. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. On the surface, the convictions looked like victory for the prosecution. Austin's citizens could finally believe that the killers were behind bars. Families of the victims, while heartbroken that nothing could bring back their daughters, at least had the comfort of knowing someone was being held responsible. But behind closed doors, doubts persisted. Defense attorneys and legal experts pointed out that the confessions had come after marathon interrogation sessions, some lasting more than 20 hours. Critics argued that the men had been broken down psychologically, pressured into saying what detectives wanted to hear. In fact, video footage from Scott's interrogation showed him being led by investigators, sometimes changing his story after suggestions were made. Even more troubling was the absence of physical evidence. No DNA, fingerprints, or forensic material tied Springsteen or Scott to the crime scene. The fire had erased much of the evidence, but investigators were still left with a troubling fact: the strongest link between the men and the murders were their own words, spoken under immense pressure. Despite these concerns, The convictions stood. For the families, this period was bittersweet. On one hand, there was a sense of justice at last. On the other, nagging doubts never fully disappeared. Were these really the killers, or had the desperate need for closure led to the wrong men being punished? For several years, Springsteen and Scott remained behind bars, their cases hailed by some as proof that persistence had paid off. Yet, in the background, advances in forensic science, particularly DNA testing, were slowly reshaping the way investigators looked at the evidence. It would not be long before those scientific tools would call everything into question, threatening to unravel the very convictions that had taken nearly a decade to achieve. Not long after the convictions of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, serious doubts began to surface about whether justice had truly been served. At first, the confessions seemed convincing. They contained details that matched aspects of the crime scene. But as defense attorneys, journalists, and independent investigators began reviewing the case more closely, cracks in the story became impossible to ignore. The most troubling concern was the manner in which the confessions were obtained. Both Springsteen and Scott had been questioned for long hours, under circumstances that critics described as exhausting and manipulative. Michael Scott, in particular, was seen on videotape struggling to recall details until investigators suggested possibilities, which he then repeated back. His account shifted multiple times, leaving observers to wonder how much of his confession was truly his memory and how much was the product of leading questions. Robert Springsteen's statement raised similar issues. While prosecutors celebrated it as a breakthrough, defense attorneys pointed out that his story also changed over time, and many of the so-called key details he provided were already publicly known or had been hinted at by investigators themselves. To critics, the confessions were less a revelation of guilt and more a reflection of the immense pressure placed on two young men desperate to end their interrogations. Adding to the skepticism was the lack of physical evidence. In most murder cases, prosecutors rely on DNA, fingerprints, or at least some forensic material to tie suspects to the scene. But in the yogurt shop murders, nothing directly connected Springsteen or Scott to the crime. No DNA, no prints, no trace evidence, nothing. The fire had destroyed much of what might have been left, but the fact remained: the state's entire case rested on words extracted under duress. Outside the courtroom, questions grew louder. Legal experts and advocates for the wrongfully convicted began comparing the case to other high-profile instances where false confessions had led to miscarriages of justice. Psychologists explained how vulnerable individuals, especially young suspects, could be pushed into confessing to crimes they did not commit, simply because they believed it was the only way to escape the relentless questioning. Even some within law enforcement began to privately express concern. While many detectives still believed they had the right men, others admitted that the case felt incomplete. It was difficult to reconcile the brutality and complexity of the crime with the shaky evidence used to convict. For the families of the victims, the doubts were devastating. After years of uncertainty, they had finally been told that the killers were caught and punished. But now, whispers of wrongful convictions threatened to reopen old wounds. Were these truly the men responsible for the deaths of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, or had the real killers been free all along? As these questions mounted, new developments in forensic science would soon throw the entire case into turmoil. DNA technology was advancing rapidly by the early 2000s, and when applied to the yogurt shop evidence, it would deliver results that changed everything, forcing the courts and the public to reconsider what they thought they knew about one of Texas's most infamous crimes. By the late 2000s, nearly 2 decades had passed since the yogurt shop murders, and the case was still one of the most painful mysteries in Texas. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott remained behind bars, but doubts about their guilt had only grown stronger. Then came the turning point that would change everything: advances in DNA testing. When the murders happened in 1991, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Many of the forensic samples recovered from the yogurt shop fire had been too degraded, too small, or simply beyond the capabilities of the science at the time. But by the 2000s, laboratories had developed much more sophisticated methods that could analyze even tiny fragments with remarkable precision. In 2008, investigators re-examined the evidence from the crime scene. Among the items tested was biological material found on one of the victims. The results were shocking. The DNA profile did not match Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. In fact, it did not match any of the men who had ever been indicted in connection with the case. Instead, it belonged to an unknown male, whose identity remains a mystery to this day. This revelation undermined the state's entire case. Prosecutors had argued for years that Springsteen and Scott were directly involved in the murders. But if that were true, why did the only viable DNA evidence exclude them completely? Defense attorneys seized on this point, arguing that the convictions were built on nothing but coerced confessions. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed. Both convictions were officially overturned, and Springsteen and Scott were released from prison after spending years behind bars for crimes they likely did not commit. For them, it was a bittersweet victory, their freedom restored, but their names forever linked to one of the most notorious cases in state history. For the victims' families, the news was devastating. The hope that justice had been achieved was ripped away. Once again, they were left with nothing but questions. Who was the unknown man whose DNA had been found? Where was he now? And most importantly, why had the wrong people been locked up for so long? The release of Springsteen and Scott also sparked outrage among legal experts and the public. Many criticized the investigative tactics used in the 1990s, pointing to the reliance on confessions without corroborating evidence. Others accused the justice system of being more concerned with closing a case than with finding the truth. The yogurt shop murders became a cautionary tale, cited in debates about false confessions, wrongful convictions, and the importance of forensic science. But despite the dramatic turn of events, the central mystery remained unsolved. 4 teenage girls had been murdered in one of the most brutal crimes Austin had ever seen. Nearly 2 decades later, the only physical clue pointed to an unknown suspect who had yet to be identified. The case, once thought to be closed, was suddenly wide open again. And with it came a chilling reality. The true killers of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy might still be out there, living freely while their victims' families continued to wait for justice. With the release of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott in 2009, the yogurt shop murders once again returned to square one. Nearly 2 decades after the crime, the one piece of hard forensic evidence investigators had the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene belonged to an unknown male. This meant that the real perpetrator, or at least one of them, had never been identified. The implications were staggering. For years, prosecutors had insisted they had solved the case. But the DNA evidence made it undeniable: the men once convicted were not responsible. The mystery of who had killed Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy remained just as haunting as it had been in 1991. Detectives were left with a difficult task. They had a DNA profile, but it matched no one in state or national databases at the time. Every time investigators ran the profile against Cody's, the combined DNA index system used in the U.S., the results came back the same: no hit. The unknown man's identity remained hidden, and without a match, the case was stuck. This reality created a paradox for law enforcement. On one hand, they had stronger scientific evidence than ever before, proof that could one day lead directly to the killer. On the other, they had no way of knowing when or if the databases would produce a match. Until then, the investigation was stalled, with detectives left only to revisit old interviews, reconsider past suspects, and wait for technology to catch up. For the victims' families, this was agonizing. Every advance in DNA testing seemed to promise a breakthrough. Yet year after year passed without answers. Parents grew older, siblings grew up, and the hope of justice seemed to fade into an endless cycle of waiting. Each press conference from police brought the same message: the case was still open, but there was nothing new to report. The community, too, was left uneasy. The thought that an unidentified killer might still be walking free, perhaps even living in Austin, cast a long shadow over the city. People who had grown up in the area remembered vividly the fear that gripped Austin in the early 1990s, and the unresolved nature of the case meant those memories never fully healed. For investigators, the DNA evidence became both a blessing and a curse. It was the key to solving the case, yet it also highlighted the stark reality that everything else, the interrogations, the confessions, the trials, had been wrong. The profile of the unknown man was a ghost, a silent reminder that the real answers still lay hidden somewhere in the past. As the years went on, technology improved further. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that had helped solve cases like the Golden State Killer, became a potential new path forward. Yet applying it required resources, permissions, and sometimes sheer luck. For the yogurt shop case, investigators hinted that genealogy searches might eventually be used, but as of today, no public breakthrough has been announced. The case remains one of the most chilling unsolved crimes in Texas. For innocent lives taken, for families devastated, and an entire city haunted. And the truth, locked inside a strand of DNA, continues to wait for the day when science, perseverance, and time finally reveal the face of the killer. More than 3 decades have now passed since the December night in 1991, and the yogurt shop murders remain etched into Texas history as one of its darkest and most infamous unsolved crimes. Despite years of investigation, countless interviews, and multiple trials, the case stands unresolved, a cold case that continues to cast a long shadow over Austin. For many in the city, the tragedy is not just a story from the past but a wound that has never fully healed. Residents who were teenagers themselves at the time of the murders often recall how it changed the atmosphere of Austin overnight. Before the crime, the city was seen as a safe, welcoming place where people rarely locked their doors. Afterward, fear lingered in every corner. Parents became more protective, communities became more cautious, and the innocence of the era was lost. The case has since become a kind of haunting legend. Generations of Austin police officers have worked on it, each new detective inheriting the responsibility of trying to solve a puzzle that has resisted every attempt at resolution. The file has grown thicker with each passing year, filled with leads, interviews, and theories, but the name of the true killer or killers remains absent. Part of what keeps the yogurt shop murders alive in public memory is the sheer cruelty of the crime. 4 young girls, full of life and potential, were taken in a manner so brutal that it defies understanding. The deliberate fire only added to the horror, transforming a place of light-hearted gathering into a symbol of loss. Even now, people who drive past the site of the former yogurt shop can't help but remember what happened there. Media coverage, documentaries, and true crime discussions continue to revisit the case. Each retelling raising the same haunting questions: who committed this act, why did they target these girls, and how have they managed to evade justice for so long? The lack of answers only fuels fascination and frustration. For the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, the decades have been marked by grief and resilience. Some parents have spoken publicly, emphasizing that while the case remains unsolved, the girls themselves must not be forgotten. They were more than victims, they were daughters, sisters, and friends whose futures were stolen. Each anniversary of the murders brings renewed calls for justice, and each passing year without resolution deepens the ache of uncertainty. Today, the case is frequently cited in conversations about wrongful convictions, false confessions, and the evolving role of DNA in solving crimes. It stands as a reminder of both the limitations of past investigative methods and the hope that modern technology might still deliver the breakthrough needed. But until that day comes, the yogurt shop murders remain more than just a crime. They are a symbol of unanswered questions, a chilling reminder that even with all the advances of science and all the determination of investigators, some mysteries refuse to be solved. For Austin, for Texas, and for true crime history, it is a story that will not fade. As we come to the end of this story, the yogurt shop murders remain a chilling reminder of how fragile justice can be. Decades have passed, but the questions are still as raw as they were in 1991. Who entered that shop on a quiet December night? What drove them to commit such brutality? And why has the truth managed to stay hidden for more than 30 years? What makes this case endure is not only the violence of the crime but the profound sense of unfinished justice. For the victims' families, there has never been closure. They have lived through arrests, trials, convictions, overturned verdicts, and the cruel realization that the true killers may still be free. The cycle of hope and disappointment has defined their lives, and even today, every new advancement in forensic science brings with it both anticipation and heartbreak. For the city of Austin, the yogurt shop murders changed the way people saw their community. The case shattered the illusion of safety and left scars that shaped a generation. It forced law enforcement to confront the limitations of their methods, the dangers of relying on coerced confessions, and the need for physical evidence that can stand the test of time. In the broader conversation about true crime, the case is often cited as a lesson. It underscores the importance of patience, accuracy, and the recognition that justice rushed is justice at risk. It has been studied in law schools, analyzed in criminal justice courses, and revisited in countless documentaries and podcasts not because it has answers, but because it embodies the power of unanswered questions. But beyond the investigations, the trials, and the controversies, this story matters because of the 4 girls whose lives were stolen. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. They were not statistics or case numbers. They were teenagers with futures ahead of them, futures that could have been filled with careers, families, and laughter. Their lives deserve to be remembered not only for how they ended, but for the light they brought to those who knew them. As of today, the DNA evidence remains the most promising key to unlocking the truth. Perhaps one day, a new match will appear in the database. Perhaps genetic genealogy will finally reveal the unknown man whose presence at the crime scene has lingered like a ghost. Until that happens, the case remains open, waiting for the moment when science and persistence finally bring justice. For now, the yogurt shop murders remain one of Texas's most infamous cold cases, a story of tragedy, failure, resilience, and hope. It reminds us that some mysteries last far longer than we want them to, but also that the pursuit of truth never really stops. And so, as we close this chapter tonight, we remember the 4 young lives lost, the families who still grieve, and a community forever changed. The answers may still be hidden, but the memory of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy continues to live on. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the darkest and most enduring mysteries in modern American history. Until next time, take care and remember that even the coldest of cases can one day find the light of justice.